Neptune. So this Saturn-Neptune cycle started in 1989 in Capricorn, like we said. That was with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That signified the end of the previous Saturn-Neptune cycle, having to do with the Cold War, and the beginning of this global corporatocracy cycle, this top-down control where government and corporations are working together, where there's really no left or right at the top anyway. They try to create it amongst the masses to divide us, but at the top there really is none. There's just the globalist right, globalist left. When a globalist right person was in office, in office, their administration's job was to weaken other countries to get them in line with the globalist plans, in overturning the governments and whatnot. And then when a leftist globalist is in power, they're weakening America's trade. They're doing things to make it to the point where America has a better choice of joining a global order than staying sovereign, etc. Okay, that's just the general way to look at that. Then the waxing square is in the late 90s. The opposition, the culmination, 2006, 2007-ish, and then the waning square, 2015, 2016, and then the conjunction that's coming up here now on the horizon will be the end of this cycle. And with my background and what I just introduced about high value information, I'm going to focus on essentially the problem that needs a solution, right? And that has to do a lot with this cycle. Okay, so February of 89 and November of 89, this is when the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn occurred. Again, this was when the first speech on global warming, and that back then it was called global warming, it wasn't called climate change. That was in 1989. Now, coincidentally, also in 1989, the UN suggested that there was a 10-year tipping point. We hear about that all the time now, right? Obviously, it didn't happen. I'm going to show you that article in a couple of slides, okay? And then just as a reminder, Margaret Thatcher made her speech, again, about this new global threat, right? And what she was doing was introducing this idea, right? This idea that, we can tax carbon, make more money. There's a global problem, and the only way to solve that is a global solution. In other words, all countries coming together in one global order. It's really what the intentions of Saturn, Neptune, and Capricorn are at the heart of it, right? It's like, and we're going to prevent war, right? But like I said, both the top, both the who pretend to be the left and the right kind of work together to get all the countries on board for that intention. And that was really the intention, was to get us at this point to be in that global order. Okay. But we'll talk about how things are falling apart in that realm. Also back then, around the late 80s, early 90s, there was a widespread, talk about lingering contrails, right? Contrails coming from the airplanes. People call them chemtrails. I mean, technically they are still condensation trails. There is water vapor condensing onto particles. It's just, the question is, what are those particles? Why do those clouds linger, right? When most contrails just disappear. For the context of this, we don't care about what the chemicals are that are being condensed upon. But we're going to talk about the thermodynamic consequences of creating these like human cirrus clouds. Okay. And then maybe not coincidentally, and then we're going to hit on this too, we'll see how that works, is Pfizer actually received its patent for the mRNA technology. So I'm not picking on vaccines specifically, but I mean, I should say generally, I'm picking on the mRNA technology. The patent was received in 1990. So right around the beginning of this cycle. Sort of like the nuclear weapons, when there's a toy to play with, a lot of times there's an impetus to find an outlet for that toy. And we're going to see how 30 years later, when Saturn returned to Capricorn for the first time since this conjunction with Neptune, how that I think you remember what happened 30 years later. But yeah, we'll talk about that and how that fits in. So I just wanted to throw that in there too, just as an added capstone to that. And it's just interesting how carbon dioxide is being attacked here. This is just a basic diagram of photosynthesis, right? You need sunshine, you need carbon dioxide, you need water. Those three things, and you can produce a carbon-based vegetation. That becomes our food. That becomes, all the trees on the planet. That becomes everything that is life on the planet, and that makes the oxygen so that the mammals can breathe, right? So the whole cycle of life is basically dependent on having sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. So if you're gonna try to reduce any of those three things, if that's your goal, like Like, and if you think about it right now, we're going to talk about how just yesterday, there was an article that I'll show you in Britain where they're going to start exploring the idea of, or they're going to actually, I think they're going to officially allow for spraying the skies to block the sun. And we obviously know there are plans in order to reduce carbon dioxide, right? So two things that will kind of reduce life essentially is what they're trying to do. But I digress. Anyway, so the world will end in 12 years. We all heard that from Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. Okay, she said that in 2018, referring to 2030 as the year when the tipping point will happen, et cetera. Of course, there is Agenda 2030, which is the Global Economic Forum. The UN and things like that. They're very much into the idea of, again, having us in a global order by then, and had their plans worked out with, who was president in the United States in 2016, we'd probably be there right now. But it's interesting, Al Gore, literally, like I said, in 1989, beginning of the Saturn-Neptune cycle in Capricorn, that was his first speech on global warming, right? That's 30, so 30, she said this in 2018, 2019, so it was like 30 years later, right? Okay, and he's right. He's been saying it for 30 years. In fact, she was born in 1989, which is at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. So pretty interesting. Okay, don't pay attention to anything on the middle or the right yet. Look at only what is on the left. Okay, I said a couple slides ago that the UN in 1989 had announced that we had a 10-year tipping point coming. So this is just the first couple paragraphs of that. It says, environmental officials says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend, again, we're talking about global warming. They didn't say climate change back then. They had to change it when it wasn't warming like it was supposed to. Global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. So we all remember the disasters that happened 25 years ago in the year 2000. If you don't, I'm sure it was just too traumatic, and that's why you can't remember it. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of refugees, et cetera, et cetera. He said the governments would have a 10-year window of an opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. And things are still not beyond human control. I think, we're doing okay. And if we're going to show some high value information to show that is true. This is all low value information. Okay, this is a great example of low value information. In this middle slide here is just a bunch of examples of blaming life for causing climate change. Because now we're doing more modern articles. So we're talking about climate change instead of global warming. Moose eat so much they may worsen climate change. What does that even mean? What do you mean worsen climate change? What climate is great? What is the ideal climate? There's no specification. The cutest climate change culprits, Arctic ground squirrels. Hungry wild pigs are worsening climate change. Beavers are accelerating climate change in Alaska. Study suggests a link between feral horses and peatland carbon emissions. I get it. You get it. The link between obesity and climate change. There was recently an article this past week about dogs and climate change, about how owning a dog is contributing to climate change. Again, because they call it climate change now, it's just very vague. And what do you mean? Because the climate always changes. Never hasn't changed. I'm going to show that too as well. Over here on the right, we have this. This is great because the math doesn't really work out on this, because every single one of these kind of claims the same thing. Finland is warming faster than the rest of the world. Canada warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Australia is heating up faster than the rest of the world. South Pole warming 3 times faster than the rest of the earth. Africa is warming more and faster than the rest of the world, right? Israel warming up as fast. New England warming up faster than the rest of the world. The idea is that wherever you live, you're going to pick up on that, and you're going to feel guilty, like, oh man, what are we doing here that we can't change? But the idea is, if for all this to be true, mathematically, there would have to be a whole bunch of places that are, warming half as much or 1/3 as much as the rest of the world, right? Because if there's an average, this doesn't add up. They can't all be above average, right? And where are these places that are, warming up less or not warming at all, right? They're not talking about that, because in reality, this is just low value information to stir an emotional reaction. And that's all it really is. Okay. But anyway, that was all started. This whole thing was started at the beginning of this cycle. When we get to the waxing square, June 98 to April 99, it's late 90s. I was in college. I was a meteorology major. And I was trying to figure out if I even wanted to do it, what kind of work I would do. And that's when this whole idea came to me. It was brand new back then. 1989, it started. It was the birth of weather derivatives. That's a market for weather risk management. It's kind of like insurance. Okay. And you probably have never heard what this is. What was funny is when I did this talk at the San Diego Astrological Society, is there was actually someone in the room who knew exactly what this was. He actually works with it. He works in like finance and whatnot. So this was not new to him. It was new to everybody else in the room. And it was new to me in 1999 when it came out, when the Chicago Mercantile Exchange introduced trading weather futures. So what it really is energy companies or any company with a bottom line that's affected by the weather. So for example, you have a ski resort, you want a farm. If you own something that has a lot to do with the weather, then you could trade weather derivatives. So you can hedge against losses. So for unexpected weather events. So you're basically like using like climate forecasts for that specific summer or spring or whatever it is, that growing season, and you're hedging bets. So if you're at a ski resort, for example, you might hedge a bet that you're going to get a certain amount of snow, and if you don't get a certain amount, you might be able to get paid out. Okay, so it covers you if your ski resort didn't get enough snow for you to have enough activity on there to make a profit, et cetera. So that's generally how it works. Very interesting. Okay, and it seems innocent. Okay, but it comes out of this idea that, remember, the whole birth of this cycle has to do with the idea of us affecting the climate, right? And then what has to be done about that to stop it, right? Okay. And this is also energetically consistent astrologically. Saturn in Taurus, Neptune in Aquarius. It's the idea of like monetizing a structure, right? Monetizing Taurus structure for this very nebulous Neptune futures, Aquarius, right? So, like they say, you never know, you can't control Mother Nature, right? Or can you? But anyway, here, exchange traded weather futures jump in popularity. You can see, because that was in 1999, but again, here, 20 years later, it was still kind of like not that popular, but over the last several years, it's skyrocketing. So there's a lot more contracts for trading weather futures, et cetera, now. And again, that seems all innocent and everything. Here's just a brief list of some companies that do it, because people say, well, it's, who these companies and whatnot. So, I mean, it's out there. It's not something new. And the reason why I bring it up is because it creates an incentive, at least, to modify the weather for profit, right? Because if there was a way to, control is a strong word, but if there was a way to, modify the weather, in other words, make it rain more, make it snow less, make it, do something where you could then profit off of it because of, your payouts. Well, that's an interesting development, right? If only we could control the weather, right? Or modify the weather. But anyway, just why would we want to modify the weather? Outside of that, I have that right there, modification for profit, weather derivatives. But I mean, we can go just to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This is just a random workshop that I found from 2008 in Colorado. So just to show that this is not new, and this is a conference on planned and inadvertent weather modification. So it's talking about hurricane modification specifically. And this has been going on for a long time. In fact, the first successfully modified hurricane was Project Cirrus. If you look it up, it's 1947, where they worked on steering a hurricane that ended up hitting Savannah, Georgia. Okay. And there was actually like lawsuits and things when people found out like what happened there, how the government was actually, intentionally making a hurricane turn in a direction it wouldn't normally turn. So we've had the technology to do this stuff for a long time. It's only perfected now. Okay. And that makes you wonder, what could that be used for? Well, for the military intentions, for national security, could we use it to protect ourselves, for example, from a hurricane, protecting from disastrous storms? But think about it. It can also be used as a weapon, right? The Air Force published a paper called Owning the Weather by 2025. That was back in 1996. It's interesting because here we are in 2025, right? And I don't think the government or the Air Force owns the weather at this point. I think that's a little bit, outlandish, but certainly they've been experimenting with it since 1996, if that was their intention, right? Okay. And then there was a Rutgers University climatologist that claimed that his department in New Jersey was where they hired, basically the people were hired by the CIA to control other nations' climate. So that's the other side of like, hurricane modification or whatnot. Is what if you could steer a hurricane into a place where you want to weaken the economy or, whatever you're trying to do to overturn a government, right? That could be done if you have the technology to do it. If you're interested in more weather modification in general, I would recommend Climate Viewer. Just Google that. That is Jim Lee. He has a lot of videos he does on it too. You don't have to agree with him on everything, but as far as organized information goes, his website's amazing. It goes back 100 plus years of all the patents, all the programs, anything that has to do with weather modification, whether it's government, private, whatever. He has done a really good job at compiling it all. So if you just want to go to the high value information, he has it on his site, right? That would be my recommendation. And again, this, like I said, this is not new. You go back to 1961, JFK even said, we shall propose further cooperative efforts between all nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control. So when the Air Force wrote that paper in 1996, that's, 35 years after Kennedy said that. So this has always been in the back pocket of the government and Department of Homeland Security, the idea that we could use weather modification as a weapon, essentially, right? So one way we can modify weather is through cloud seeding. Cloud seeding has been around for a long time. When I took an atmospheric physics course my senior year of undergrad, I remember having a test question on where we had to use calculus kind of based physics to figure out if you had a certain amount of what's called silver iodide, which is a rain enhancer essentially, how much more rain could you expect with this volume of silver iodide, right? We had to do the math on it. So the idea is the way that rain works, rain doesn't fall out of the sky in thin air. All a cloud is condensed water vapor on a particle. There's natural air particles. If there was no particles, it would never rain. Okay. And all silver iodide does is it increases the probability that water vapor will condense onto a particle, and because it increases that probability, it increases the chance that it'll be heavy enough to actually fall to the ground. So it is used to enhance rain. It's been used for decades to enhance rain. Okay, so we learned about it in atmospheric physics class in around 2000 or so, and at that point, it had already been being used for 50 years or more. So it was not new in 2000. It's not new in 2025. So that's one way we can enhance rainfall, right? But think of the implications of that, because if you enhance rainfall here, then you decrease the rainfall downstream. So you're essentially stealing the potential moisture of the area downstream, which might have got that moisture had you not taken it out of the air. So there's a lot of implications for this when it comes to regulation and whatnot, but it goes under the radar, okay, quote unquote. But there's a lot of programs in the US, outside the US, it's all over the place for that. Another thing that, so in other words, that's, this is one way we can affect the weather is through enhancing rainfall. Another way is by affecting the temperature of the atmosphere. This is a paper that was done in 2004 that went over the 3-day period in mid-September that followed 9/11, where there was aircraft grounded, right? There was no aircraft flying. So there was no jet contrail influence on the climate, right? Like I said, these are affectionately known as chemtrails because they linger unlike regular contrails, right? But they are essentially just water vapor condensed onto a particle. And what's funny is here, this is an actual meteorologist talking about it, right? And they're referring to them as homogeneous cirrus. So cirrus clouds are just high clouds. They're wispy high clouds. They're naturally present, but when we're creating them with the air, the contrails, et cetera, now we can call them man-made cirrus, right? That's homogeneous, man-made cirrus clouds. So like it says, you can't make this stuff up. This is true. It's been happening. It's been going on for a long time. And I only bring it up because, again, this study went over that 3-day period, and it compared that 3-day period to other mid-September periods in the past, so over many number of years. September is a great year to do a study like that because, generally speaking, it's really nice weather across the whole U.S. And if you remember 9/11, New York City, that was actually outside of the aircraft situation and the smoke that was coming from the buildings. I mean, there wasn't really any clouds in the sky. It was probably 72 degrees and sunny. Just very stable weather is my point. And so that's something you could pretty much expect at that time of year, anywhere across the US. It's going to be pretty predictable as far as what it's going to be. And so what this study sought out to do was to see, by not having those contrails in the sky for those 3 days, how does that 3-day period compare to that same 3-day period in other years? And what they found was that there was a stark increase in what's called diurnal temperature range. And all that is, that's DTR for short, is if, for example, the high temperature was 80 degrees and the low temperature was 60 degrees, then the DTR is 20. It's just a difference between a high and low. That's all it really is. But all that was printed in this study in 2004 was the results of that daily temperature range. They didn't print anything about what the high temperatures were, the low temperatures were. They just printed out, and they found out that there was a significant expansion of diurnal temperature range during that 3-day period that the planes were grounded relative to that similar period in other years. And so intuitively, what that makes you think is like, wow, you take away the clouds, those man-made clouds, and the daily temperature range expanded. Oh, it must be warmer. The clouds must be cooling it. And that's the opposite of what is actually true. And that's because high clouds, these cirrus clouds, they have a net warming effect. They reflect more heat down to the earth than they prevent heat from the sun coming in. Okay. And that's well known. That's not a new thing, that low clouds have a net cooling effect. High clouds have a net warming effect. And so I was curious about this. I was like, why wouldn't they print the highs and lows? Right. So I actually emailed David Travis, and he was very easy to communicate with. And what he told me was that they did initially publish the highs and lows to make the distinction, to show that the high clouds were having the net warming effect. Right. And then I said, well, and he said they would have published it that way, but the National Science Foundation, who was funding that study, said, no, we only want that paper if it's expressed in DTR. In other words, DTR is really a useless piece of information. Okay, I think the National Science Foundation was curious to see if we were warming the planet essentially inadvertently by having the cirrus clouds as a result of aircraft. And they found out that they were right, that we are warming the planet with that. So if we take those away, it cools it, because what happened, the reason why DTR expanded during the time that the planes were landed was because the low temperatures were lower. The high temperatures were pretty much the same as they would be in any given year, but the low temperatures were lower without the presence of the clouds, because more heat could escape to space. Okay. That's what I mean. This is why cirrus clouds have a net warming effect. And so pretty much found out what you would expect to find out. And it's pretty significant as well. Okay. So if that's confusing, you can rewind and listen to it again. Also send me questions if you do have any. I will be happy to explain further. But the point is, we found out with that study that, oops, yeah, if there's any warming going on, it's probably from us. And that's especially clear to see here, because again, the maximum temperatures were not affected. Minimum temperatures were significantly affected. They were significantly cooler during the planes being grounded than they would normally be. Okay, that's what we found out. So we found out that those cirrus clouds are leading to warming in the minimum temperatures, not the maximum. And you can see here, this is measured summer maximums in the US. Okay, and so this is only the summer months, so it's probably June, July, August. And it is only maximum. It's not minimum. So it's not average temperature. It's not the average between the max and minimum. It's just max. And like you can see here, the trend from about 1895, which is like 100 and, over 125 years of data here, is downward. Right? And you think, whoa, wait, I thought it was warming. I thought it was global warming, right? It's because the minimum temperatures are actually going up. So the average temperature, right? The average temperature, you can make an argument that, yeah, there has been a rise in average temperature since the mid 1800s. But that's a rise in average temperature, not in maximum temperature. Say the maximum temperatures were peaking in the 1930s. That's 1934 right there. And they've been coming down pretty steadily ever since. Okay. So it's not as hot in the summer in the US as it used to be. And this is high value information that tells us that. Okay. This is not headlines. This is not, this is the hottest summer ever, hottest summer, not according to the data. Again, not according to high value information. It isn't. But the idea is when you tease that out, when you separate the maximums from the minimums, and you don't use average temperature, you can really see that. I mean, it's not getting hotter in the summer. And if carbon dioxide was the culprit in causing warming, you would see that here, because carbon dioxide doesn't work at night. It doesn't work in the poles when it's the winter time, because all it can do is absorb and re-radiate heat. It can't store heat. Okay, and so it's a signature you would see during the daytime during maximum temperatures. It would be if CO2 going up, could cause warming, you would see it in this graph and it would be going up with the CO2, but you don't see it. Okay. Anyway, 31 states right now are putting forth legislation to clear the skies. Now, in my opinion, so this is not high value information, but in my opinion, they're not clear on the difference between cloud seeding and homogeneous clouds, in other words, that are from aircraft. A lot of people mix them up. They see the chemtrails, what they call them chemtrails, and the homogeneous clouds, and they say, oh, they're cloud seeding. It's like, no, that is not cloud seeding. Okay, they're two different things. Okay, so it is unclear to me whether they're clear of what they're actually legislating against. Okay, are they making a distinction? Are they legislating against both? Are they saying no to cloud seeding and no to homogeneous clouds? I don't know. Florida is actually just the last couple of weeks passed the Senate bill to do this. So it'd be interesting to see how this goes forward. So this is not like conspiracy stuff. This is reality. This is in the legislation where we're understanding like where humans actually affect the weather and affect the climate. It's not CO2. It's in the things that we actually do to our skies, and that includes intentional cloud seeding. Okay, so that takes us to the culmination phase of the Saturn-Neptune cycle that started in Capricorn. This is 2006. 2007, okay? This is when the film Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore was released, and it was this is what brought widespread awareness to climate change, the whole narrative. It was also used to indoctrinate students. So if you are probably like early to mid 30s or younger, this is probably something you saw in the classroom as part of your indoctrination / education, which is, what's the difference, right? And lots of errors in that movie. I remember seeing that. I mean, I was in my mid 20s. I had just finished a couple of years ago my second master's. I taught global climate, like I said, and so there's some things in this that I was just like, what? Because part of me back then was kind of like confused because I knew the high value data, which didn't really suggest that anything crazy was going on, but the low value information was influencing me, and so I kind of was on board with the idea of the global warming narrative, even though the data didn't jive. Anyway, also in that year, 2006, the UN had climate talks where they resulted in the first general consensus amongst world leaders for greenhouse gas emission reductions, which basically means carbon dioxide reductions, right? So this is the culmination. It all started in 1989, the first talk by Al Gore, Margaret Thatcher talking about the new threat to the globe, right? And this whole idea of us warming the climate, et cetera. And now it's culminating with getting into the mainstream, right? Getting actual leaders on board to do something, quote unquote, right? To solve the problem, the global problem from a global perspective, right? This is the globalist, perception. Also in 2006, in California specifically, in the state, they had an act where they were basically going to reduce overall carbon emissions in the state by 2020. I don't think they've achieved that. I mean, that was 5 years ago. I don't think that it was achieved to reduce carbon emissions, and it's not like it's made any difference. Also in 2007, this is when carbon trading was kind of birthed out of the EU. And so this is similar to weather derivatives that we talked about, right? Where you can make money, right? With carbon trading, you could trade carbon and make money. Weather derivatives, you can make money, and especially if you can modify the weather, you could, fraudulently make money by modifying the weather, which is kind of like next level, evil, Dr. Evil kind of stuff, right? Anyway, and then in November 2007, so just after this period, this is when there was some litigation that was going on, Massachusetts versus the EPA, and what it resulted in was CO2 being okay for CO2 to be regulated as a pollutant, not that it is a pollutant, because CO2 is not a pollutant. Okay, so there's a list of pollutants in the EPA that are regulated under the Clean Air Act. CO2 is not one of them because it's not a pollutant. It's part of the natural, cycle of life, essentially, right? But what that ruling said was that even though it's not a pollutant, it could be regulated the same way that those pollutants are regulated under Clean Air Act. So they're not going to list it there because that would be scientifically fraudulent. But they basically said, yeah, you can regulate it the same way, even though it's essential to life. And we're going to see how it's actually more dangerous to have less CO2 than to have more. Okay, and we'll get to that. Anyway, 2008. This is, I was a Weather Channel fiend when I was a teenager, college, whatever. It was purchased in 2008 and the whole format changed. It was an NBC affiliate, bought it, and they fired a bunch of people. They created a new format, and that format was basically severe weather, fear mongering. Everything's the biggest storm of the century, right? Everything. It used to be pretty tame before 2008, where they just, reported on the weather, showed up to the weather events, and they were neutral about it. If a storm was weakening, they were talking about that. Now everything's worst case scenario, right? So thank you, NBC affiliate. So this is where the media kind of got their hands in it. And then notice the new logo for the Weather Channel has those homogeneous clouds in it, right? Those man-made cirrus clouds, as if that's normal, as if that's natural, right? So you can see how things change there during this culmination phase. And just speaking about Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth, here is a graph that he used, a version of this graph, within the exact graph, but where he showed the peaks and valleys. This is the natural glaciation and retreat that happens in the climate. Notice how it happens at regular intervals, about every 100,000 years. We have a rapid warming, it lasts about 10 to 12,000 years. Then there's a gradual glaciation. The glaciers advance over the continents. And then whoop, big warming, everything melts. And then a gradual glaciation. Big warming, everything melts. Okay, our recent big warming, that started around about 20,000 years ago. Okay, and it peaked right in this modern time. Okay, the last 10,000 years or so. So we're in what's called an interglacial. This is an interglacial here. We're in this interglacial. There's another interglacial there, and interglacial there. So we've been in an ice age, technically, on Earth for 2.5 million years. So this is going back, 400,000 years or so. So take that back like six times the length of this graph, and it follows the same pattern. Because this is all solar cycles. Okay, this is like the Milankovitch cycles. It's like chapter 1 of climate science is the Milankovitch cycles, and this is the orbital aspects of the sun and Earth. So there's times when the Earth is in a warming phase, rapid warming, when the sun and Earth are at the right angles, and then there's times when it's cooling. And that's the way it's been for 2.5 million years. Okay, and all we are in right now, and it's actually cooler than the last. Look at you, just in this phase. And if you go back, I don't have it, but if you go back, it basically every interglacial is a little cooler than the last. Okay, so we're gradually falling deeper into the ice age that we're already in. Okay, where our interglacials are brief, and then the glaciations happen. Okay, and it's hard to distinguish in this graph between what's the cause and effect, right? Temperature and CO2. And this is what Al Gore did, was he didn't say it outright because he knew it wasn't true. But what he said was, every time that CO2 is up, temperature is up. And every time CO2 is down, temperature is down. He didn't say it's causing it. He just said they were happening together, which is what it looks like, because the scale isn't good enough for us to see what's really going on there. If we actually take, and then before I get to the next slide, a lot of people say, oh, look at that peak, in the CO2 that's so much higher than the peaks here. There's a great study by David Dilley. I can send you to it. It's great. They found out that the way these were measured was a little wasn't the most accurate, and that they found that there actually were peaks at these, the same, not quite as high as ours today, because we do have some human influence in the CO2 level. So not quite as high, but high nonetheless, like a strong peak, especially right before the turn to the next glaciation. So we're in a big peak right now, which means that we're about to finish this interglacial. So that's another topic for another day. But anyway, if we take if we go here about 150,000 years ago, okay, to 100,000 years ago. So this section here. So we're going to just look at this section and stretch it out. Okay. Notice here, it's a lot easier to see what's causing and what's being affected. So it's very easy to see that temperature goes up first, carbon dioxide follows. Temperature goes down, carbon dioxide follows. So there's a lag time, and it's actually about 600 to 800 years of lag time where the carbon dioxide follows temperature. And the reason for that is because the Earth is 70% water. Okay, this is where the carbon dioxide is stored for the most part. And when it's colder water, more carbon dioxide can store. When the water warms, it has to release carbon dioxide. It's just the physics of it. It's kind of like when you open a can of soda. Once it starts warming, all those are carbon dioxide bubbles. That's carbonated, soda. that's releasing into the atmosphere. The same thing. And so where we're at now is similar to here, right? We're at the, right at the end of, at the end of the interglacial. This is the interglacial there, right before the glaciers started coming in again. Carbon dioxide is still going up, essentially, and then finally it starts to come down with the temperature, right? So it's temperature causing carbon dioxide, not the other way around. In fact, there's no high value data or information ever that has found a link between carbon dioxide causing temperature rise or temperature depletion. But there's a lot of sense, it makes sense with the oceans would be, causing the other relationship where temperature is causing carbon dioxide. Okay. And then that takes us to the waning square. Okay. That was in late November of 2015 to September of 2016. And the major theme of this phase of the cycle was now that it's in the public lexicon, people know about it from that culmination phase in 2006, 2007 and beyond. Now it's all about these agreements, these global agreements. Okay. And so it's funny because during the 1 degree orbs of this waning square with Saturn and Sagittarius squaring Neptune and Pisces, the first one was a Paris Climate Conference, which resulted in a legally binding global climate deal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there was also talk about geoengineering. So weather modification and the ways you can combat and modify climate change. So in other words, using climate change as an excuse to geoengineer the climate. Okay. In other words, cause climate change and say that you're justified in doing it because of what we're doing to the climate, right? And then there was another summit in China. And then the final square was the UN Climate Conference, which was basically ended in the Paris Climate Accord. And this is that big one that when Trump was in office, his first term, he got out of the Paris Climate Accord, and he also did it again here in his second term. And everyone said, that's terrible. Why would you do that? Why would you get out of it? In the next slide, I'm going to explain why that actually makes sense on a practical level, why you would do that. And it's interesting that all these leaders, so this whole time period, they're all flying around these climate conferences, burning a whole bunch of fossil fuels, which is supposedly causing the climate change. That now they're talking about geoengineering, and it's just a real hypocritical kind of thing to do. And here's an interesting thing: there was a peer-reviewed paper that talked about how it's okay to lie about climate because information manipulation has an instrumental value. In other words, it's better to convince us of something and then just assume that it's true and then take action on it, right? And that's really a big part of this global corporatocracy that is the theme of this Saturn-Neptune cycle that we're coming to an end to now, okay? And, on the topic of this geoengineering, okay, it's interesting because just like a week before I did that talk in early April at the San Diego Astrological Society, that I did this talk essentially, this popped up on my Facebook feed. So I took a screenshot of it. I'm not following science. They must be legit, right? They call themselves science. And here it says geoengineering could be crucial in the fight against climate change. Exactly what they were talking about back during the waning square, right? Now here we are at the very end of the cycle, and they're trying to make a last ditch effort to make this happen, right? And so this is like 4 different ways it could be done. The top 2 have to do with blocking the sun, essentially, with pollutants. Lo and behold, right? How environmental is that? Let's use pollution to block the sun. Let's block an important part of photosynthesis, right? And then here we have carbon dioxide removal. So one wants to block the sun, one wants to remove carbon dioxide, both essential in photosynthesis, like we said before. So they both want to hurt life. In my opinion, again, this is my opinion. What's happening down here with the carbon removal? Carbon dioxide, like you're going to see in a few slides, it isn't as significant as we are told to believe that it is, and that's what the high value information will tell us. So to me, this doesn't really make too much of this. This is not very egregious. Just getting some carbon out of the atmosphere, like whatever. I mean, sure, hey, we are putting extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's not much, but if we can just cut our emissions out by doing something like this, I mean, I'm not 100% against it. I don't think it has to be done at all, but this is pretty benign compared to what this wants to do up here. These injections of soot, essentially, that'll block the sun, block photosynthesis, et cetera, and put pollution in the air. Okay. And it's interesting enough, just yesterday, Today's April 23rd. This was published. This is a British newspaper. Okay. Experiments to dim the sun will be approved within weeks. So, it's right on time. Again, it's like they know that this cycle is over. And so this push to force it in there is really on the docket right now to get things going. But this is, you can't make this up. So this was not included in the talk I gave at the San Diego Astrological Society. So you get it here on this webinar and on YouTube because it came to me literally yesterday and I had to add it in.